May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Church bells rang, flags waved, and prisoners of war across America waited to go home. But in one small camp in Massachusetts, something happened that all reason. When American officers told a group of captured German women they were free to return home. They begged to stay. Who were these women? Why did they refuse freedom? This is the forgotten story of the German prisoners who chose America over home, and how compassion conquered everything war had tried to destroy. May 8, 1945. Across the world, church bells rang and streets filled with celebration. Victory in Europe Day had arrived, and the long nightmare of war was finally over. In cities from London to Los Angeles, people embraced strangers, kissed in the streets, and wept with relief. The guns had fallen silent. But far from the joyous crowds, in a small, quiet facility outside Fort Deans, Massachusetts, the end of the war brought not celebration, but uncertainty. Behind a barbed wire fence softened by spring rain, 60 German women stood listening to an American officer read the words they had dreamed of hearing for months. They were free to go home. Captain's voice echoed across the assembly yard as she spoke through a megaphone. The women, dressed in their faded gray auxiliary uniforms, stood in neat rows. Most had once served as radio operators, nurses, or clerks in the German Women's Auxiliary Corps. They had been captured during the final chaotic months of the war, taken from collapsing front lines in France and Belgium. Many still wore traces of their old insignia, though they had long since stopped saluting them. Their faces were young, but tired, girls who had stepped into uniforms before they had ever truly lived as women. When Captain finished, the women were silent. She had expected tears, relief, even celebration, but instead there was a heavy stillness. A 23-year-old communications specialist from Hamburg stood near the front, clutching a small leather diary against her chest. It was all she had left of her old life, her family gone silent for months, her city reduced to ashes. She exchanged glances with the women beside her. Anna Weber, the soft-spoken medic from Munich, and Maria Gotch, a former clerk who had once organized supply records for the Wehrmacht. Each woman's expression carried the same unspoken question: what was there left to return to? The war had ended, yes, but the Germany they had known no longer existed. Their homes might be rubble, their families might be dead, and the nation they had served was now a word spoken with shame. Thoughts drifted back to the day she was captured, the confusion, the fear, and the strange courtesy of the American soldiers who had taken them in. She had expected cruelty. Instead, she found rules, order, and even small kindnesses. In the camp, life had been simple, predictable. For the first time in years, she had food, safety, and a strange new feeling she hadn't known since before the war: peace. Captain dismissed the assembly. She noticed several women lingering, whispering among themselves. There was something hesitant in their movements, as though freedom had suddenly become a burden. One or two even looked frightened. Later that afternoon, approached outside her office. Her English was careful but clear. "Captain," she began, "when must we leave?" Looked at her in mild surprise. "Within 2 weeks," she replied. "Transport ships are being arranged to take you back to Europe." Nodded slowly, then paused. "And if someone does not wish to go?" The question hung in the air. Blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "Miss, you mean to say you don't want to return home?" His eyes lowered. "I don't know what home is anymore," she whispered. That night in the barracks, the German women gathered in low voices, their conversations broken by pauses and uncertain glances. Some spoke of fear, of what awaited them in a ruined Germany. Others spoke of guilt, the kind that had begun to gnaw at them as newspaper clippings and radio broadcasts revealed the horrors discovered in concentration camps. They had not known, they said, but ignorance did not erase shame. By the time the lights went out, a decision had begun to take root among a small group of them, one that would defy the expectations of every rule written about war, freedom, and captivity. These women, once enemies of America, would choose the unthinkable: to stay. The winter of 1944 had been cruel in Massachusetts, but by the time the war ended, the frost had given way to the early warmth of spring. The camp at Fort Deans looked less like a prison and more like a collection of modest barracks surrounded by pine trees and fences that no one seemed eager to cross. Inside, the women followed a strict routine: roll call at dawn, assigned duties through the day, and curfews that felt less like punishment and more like habit. For months, life had moved quietly, almost rhythmically, under the watchful but not hostile eyes of their American guards. Captain had been one of the few female officers overseeing prisoner operations. She'd expected defiance from her German captives, but instead she found something she hadn't anticipated: discipline mixed with dignity. The women kept their quarters clean, stood tall when addressed, and rarely complained. Some had been propaganda officers, others typists or medical aides. None had ever held a weapon, but each carried the same burden: they had served the Reich. At first, there had been silence between prisoners and guards, a language barrier, but also a moral one. Yet small acts began to bridge that divide. Private James, a young guard from Iowa, noticed one of the women coughing during inspection. Her name was Anna Weber, a soft-spoken with eyes that seemed too kind for a war uniform. Without being asked, brought her an extra blanket and a cup of tea from the mess hall. When he handed it to her through the fence, she froze, uncertain whether it was a trick. But when he smiled and said, "It's just tea, miss," something inside her cracked. She accepted it with both hands, whispering. That tiny exchange became camp legend. Kindness was contagious. Sergeant Robert, whose family had emigrated from China, began teaching English phrases to prisoners using hand gestures and drawings. In return, they taught him bits of German, laughing at his accent and his playful mistakes. Fluent and eager to learn, became an unofficial translator. She helped in the infirmary, assisted Captain with reports, and almost without realizing it, began to earn the trust of both sides. By December, the tone of the camp had shifted. There was still formality, but less fear. When Christmas approached, Captain wrestled with an idea. Should she allow a holiday gathering? It felt wrong to celebrate with the enemy, but something in her, perhaps her own fatigue with years of death, told her it was necessary. She called into her office and asked, "If we allowed music, would your women sing?" That night inside the camp's recreation hall, a single lantern cast light over a small group of German women standing before their captors. They began with "oh," voices trembling at first, then growing strong and sure. The guards stood silently, the sound stirring something deep, perhaps pity, perhaps understanding. Then, her accent careful, began Silent Night in English. The other women joined in. It wasn't perfect, but it was haunting. Private later wrote to his mother, "Ma, tonight I saw something I'll never forget. 60 German girls sang Silent Night for us. For a moment I forgot they were prisoners. They looked just like the girls back home." That night marked an invisible turning point. The fences still stood, but no one seemed to notice them anymore. The women worked harder, laughed more freely, and began to ask questions, not about the war, but about America. What did freedom mean here? Could it be that the people they were taught to hate were not monsters, but human beings like themselves? By spring, that realization had transformed Fort Deans. What had begun as captivity was slowly becoming something else, a fragile human bridge built between former enemies. And for a few of the women, it raised an unthinkable question. If this was what America was, why would they ever want to leave it by February 1945? Life inside Fort Deans bore little resemblance to the prison it had once been. The women still wore their gray uniforms, but they no longer looked like prisoners of war. They worked in the kitchens, tended the gardens, helped in the infirmary, and chatted freely with guards between duties. Captain had stopped referring to them as the German detainees. In her reports, she now called them simply the women. The camp had evolved into something human, something fragile but profoundly real. The women laughed more often now. They sang while they worked. In the evenings, could often be found in the small camp library, poring over English-language newspapers, her brow furrowed as she sounded out each sentence. She was determined to master the language that once belonged to her enemies. But one February morning, as she flipped through a newspaper from Boston, her eyes froze on a headline that would shatter the peace they had built. Concentration Camp, HORRORS REVELED. The article described the liberation of Bergen-Belsen and the discovery of thousands of emaciated bodies. It spoke of survivors who could barely stand, of soldiers sickened by what they found, of photographs so graphic they were deemed unfit for publication. His breath caught in her throat. The words blurred as she read them again and again, unwilling to believe. Across the room, Anna Weber noticed her trembling hands and came closer. "What is it?" she asked in German, handed her the paper wordlessly. Within minutes, a small circle of women had gathered, reading, whispering, then falling silent. Their faces changed as the truth sank in. These were not hardened ideologues. They had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps to serve their country, not to commit atrocities. They had believed they were defending their homeland, their families. Now they were confronted with the monstrous reality of what that homeland had done. Tears streamed down Anna's face. "Is it true?" she whispered. Could we have done this?" No one answered. Captain entered the room later that afternoon and found them huddled together in stunned silence. On the table lay the newspaper, its edges smudged from trembling hands. She had seen this before, German prisoners brought face to face with the truth of their regime. But there was something different here. These women weren't defiant. They were broken. That night wrote in her diary, "Everything I believed is gone. I thought we were honorable. I thought we fought for Germany's future. But now I see we fought for lies. I do not know who I am anymore." In the following days, the atmosphere in the camp changed again, but this time it wasn't fear or hostility that filled the air. It was grief. The women went about their tasks quietly, no longer humming songs or laughing at jokes. Even the guards, aware of the news spreading across Europe, treated them with a strange reverence. War was ending, but the reckoning was just beginning. Then came another blow. Letters from Europe, tattered, delayed, censored. Many of the women discovered their families' homes had been destroyed, their parents missing or dead. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, all reduced to ashes, received no reply from the Red Cross inquiries she'd sent months earlier. Every day she checked the mail, hopping for a word from home that never came. And yet, amid the sorrow, something remarkable began to grow: understanding. Sergeant, the Chinese-American guard who had once taught them English, brought them clippings of American speeches about rebuilding Germany, about forgiveness. "America will not destroy your people," he told one day as she translated the words aloud to the others. "It wants to help them stand again." The idea seemed impossible, and yet it sparked something deep inside her. Maybe, she thought, there was a different kind of patriotism, not the blind loyalty that had led them into war, but the courage to rebuild with honesty. Spring approached, and with it came the first whispers of peace. But for the women of Fort Deans, peace did not mean freedom, it meant a choice. Soon they would be told they could return to Germany. And for some, that thought filled them not with relief, but with dread. When the telegram arrived from Washington, Captain read it 3 times before she could believe what it said. It was brief and bureaucratic, orders to prepare the German women prisoners at Fort Deans for repatriation. Transportation ships would be leaving from Boston within weeks. For it was a simple matter of protocol. The war was over, and the time had come to send them home. But for the 60 women behind the fences, the news struck with the weight of a death sentence. By then, Fort Deans had become more than a camp. It had become a community. The women had built gardens behind the barracks, painted the walls, and learned to bake American bread in the mess hall ovens. They read English books and even joined the guards in Sunday church services. The barbed wire that once defined their captivity now seemed almost ornamental, a reminder of a past that no longer fit the present. When Captain gathered the women in the main hall to make the announcement, she expected cheers or at least smiles. Instead, she saw blank faces, eyes that darted toward one another in confusion. The silence that followed was so complete that even the sound of rain tapping the roof seemed loud. She continued, trying to sound encouraging. "You'll be processed through repatriation camps in Europe before returning to your homes. The war is over. You'll be free." She had barely finished when rose from her seat. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. "Captain," she said carefully in clear English, "some of us do not wish to return." The room seemed to tilt in that instant. Guards shifted uncomfortably, blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "You don't wish to return?" Nodded, and beside her, Anna Weber stood, followed by a dozen others. "We've been talking, ma'am," Anna added. "Germany is not our home anymore. The Germany we served no longer exists." Stared at them, speechless. In all her military experience, she had never heard of prisoners begging to remain in captivity. It violated every expectation of war and human instinct. "You're asking to stay as prisoners?" she asked softly. Gaze didn't waver. "No," she replied. "As people, as workers perhaps, as something better than we were before." Their reasons poured out over the following days. Some had no families left. Others could not bear to return to the rubble and shame of a homeland that had betrayed everything they believed in. They had found within the fences of their captivity something that felt like redemption, dignity, purpose, even kindness. Private, the young guard from Iowa, approached Captain after the assembly. His face was tight with emotion. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "these women aren't our enemies anymore. Sending them back to nothing, it feels wrong." She nodded, torn between duty and compassion. Unable to decide alone, sent an urgent message to the War Department describing the unprecedented request. The answer would take days to arrive, leaving everyone suspended between hope and uncertainty. In the meantime, life in the camp continued, but with a strange, feverish energy. The women who wished to stay threw themselves into their work, translated camp reports and letters for American staff. Anna worked long hours in the infirmary alongside Dr. Robert Hayes, the camp's medical officer. Others volunteered to repair uniforms, clean barracks, or tutor guards in German. It was as if they were trying to earn their right to remain. Outside the camp, word of their plea began to spread. Some locals were outraged. Why should Nazi prisoners be allowed to stay? One newspaper demanded, but others saw it differently. Church groups wrote letters of support, calling the women examples of faith and forgiveness. A local schoolteacher named Mrs. Henderson visited the camp and spoke passionately on their behalf. "They've learned what it means to be human again," she told. "You can't send that lesson back to the ruins of war." Each day, the tension grew. The women gathered in small groups at night, whispering about what might come next. Prayed silently before bed, her diary open beside her. "If they send us back," she wrote, "I will go. But my heart will remain here. Because in this place of all places, I learned what freedom really means." The answer from Washington came on a gray morning in late May, carried by a uniformed courier whose boots echoed through the wooden halls of Fort Deans. Captain read the message alone, her heart pounding with a mix of relief and disbelief. The War Department had granted an unprecedented exception. Any prisoner who wished to return to Germany could do so immediately. But those who had chosen to remain could apply for reclassification as displaced persons, and if they found sponsors, they could stay in the United States as free civilians. When gathered the women in the assembly hall to share the news, the air was thick with anticipation. The room fell silent as she began. "Washington has agreed to a special arrangement," she said, her voice steady but warm. "Those who wish to return to Germany may do so. Those who wish to stay will be given the chance to build new lives here." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Anna Weber's eyes filled with tears, clasped her hands together, and whispered. Of the original 60 prisoners, 9 women chose to remain. The rest, though fearful, decided to return home, to whatever pieces of Germany still stood. But that morning, the camp transformed into something unlike any prison the world had ever known. It became a crossroads between two worlds, between ruin and redemption. The women who stayed wasted no time proving themselves worthy of the faith placed in them. Mrs. Henderson, the schoolteacher who had visited often, immediately volunteered to sponsor. She found her work as a translator for local authorities processing refugees from Europe. Her command of English and German made her invaluable, but what truly set her apart was her empathy. She didn't just translate words. She translated pain, bridging the silence between survivors and officials with patience and understanding. Anna Weber was taken under the wing of Dr. Hayes, the camp physician who had seen her quiet skill in the infirmary. Under his supervision, she enrolled in nursing courses at a nearby hospital. Her hands, once used to bandage soldiers, now healed civilians. In time, she became known not as the German nurse, but as Nurse Anna, the woman who never turned away a patient, no matter their background. For the women who returned to Germany, the path was harder. Received letters months later from those who had gone back. They described cities still in ruins, streets filled with hunger and despair. Yet some wrote that the kindness they had known in America gave them hope, that perhaps reconciliation was possible, even among ashes. As months passed, the fences of Fort Deans were quietly dismantled. The camp that had once held prisoners now stood empty, its barracks converted to temporary housing for refugees. Captain, transferred to another post, received a letter written in graceful English. "You taught us that mercy is not weakness and forgiveness is not surrender. Because of you, we have become more than survivors. We have become human again." Years turned into decades. The story of the Fort Deans women faded into quiet obscurity, remembered only in fragments, until 1970, when the United Nations invited a speaker to address a conference on reconciliation. Her name was Henderson, now an American citizen with grown children. On stage in New York, she held a small leather diary in her hands, the same one she had carried into captivity. Her voice was steady as she told her story. "I was once a prisoner of war," she began. "But captivity was not where I lost my freedom. It was where I found it, because in that camp I learned that home is not a place, it is a choice. And freedom is not the absence of walls, it is the courage to build a better world beyond them." The hall fell silent as she raised her diary slightly, her eyes glistening with tears. "We discovered that America's greatest weapon was not its army, but its compassion. It defeated our hatred not with bullets, but with kindness. And in doing so, it gave us something no victory ever could: redemption." That day, the audience stood in ovation. And somewhere, far from the spotlight, perhaps Captain would have smiled to know that the prisoners she once guarded had become symbols of everything she believed in: mercy, transformation, and the quiet power of humanity to heal even the deepest wounds of war. The women who begged to stay had not just chosen America, they had chosen hope. And in that choice, they proved that even in the ruins of the world's darkest war, light could still be found.